Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for BookBound 2020, a From Home Literary Festival. My name is Georgina Lawton, and I'm here to host a discussion between the authors Sam Mills and Horatio Clare. This event has been curated in partnership with Wasafiri magazine to raise money for the UK-based mental health charity Mind. Mind provides advice and support to empower people experiencing mental health problems. Their statistics show that on average, 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem in a typical year. And 2020 is not a typical year. Make your donation to support Mind using the link to BookBound, just giving page displayed below. You can find out more about BookBound, Wasafiri, Mind, and our authors by visiting our website, bookbound2020.co.uk. And now on to our event. Sam Mills studied at Oxford University and worked as a chess journalist and publicist before becoming a full-time writer. Her debut novel, The Quiddity of Will Self, was published in 2012 to critical acclaim. And The Fragments of My Father, due out in July 2020, is a memoir on mental health and the biography of 2 carers, Leonard Woolf, husband to Virginia, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, husband to Zelda. Horatio Clare is a Welsh-born travel writer, memoirist, and children's author. His memoir, Running for the Hills, was published in 2006 and was nominated for a Guardian First Book Award. Something of His Art, published in 2019, follows Horatio as he traces the footsteps of Bach over 250 miles through Germany. So we've got lots of really interesting stuff to discuss, and thank you to the authors for joining us here for the festival today. I've got some really great questions that I want to start by asking both of you. I guess, what did you both grow up reading? Sam, if we could start with you.
Books were definitely my salvation when I was a kid because, well, this is sort of feeds into the memoir as well. I grew up in Surrey and my family were quite comfortable and everything was going really well. But when I was 3 years old, my father had a breakdown and developed schizophrenia. And we suddenly went from being a quite well-off family to being very impoverished and on benefits, and everything was quite hard. But this sounds very misery memoir, I know, but I felt like I had a really happy childhood because I just read so much, and books were totally my redemption. And my mum would go to jumble sales and bring back bags of books. Enid Blyton and Roald Dahl, who was my favourite, and I would just devour and devour book after book, and it was a kind of escape and led me to want to be a writer at a very young age, about 6 or 7. And I think my favourite was Roald Dahl's Matilda, and there's a really interesting moment in that where Matilda was so similar to me in some ways because she also was having this tough time, and she goes to the library and gets all these books out, and then she sits at home, and there's a wonderful line where she said she was in this tiny English village, but she travelled all over the world by reading Conrad and Hemingway, and she got to experience everything through her books.
Amazing. And Horatio, how did you grow up, and what books did you grow up reading?
So I was between Wales and London, and my parents had a sheep farm in the Black Mountains, and then they broke up, and when I was about 6. And so we moved to this sheep farm, and it had no TV. You couldn't get a signal. And my mum had been a children's book reviewer for the Evening Standard, so we had shed loads of books and no money. And so we read like fury, Asterix and Tintin to start with, and then obviously things like Dahl. I think that was my first complete book, was Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. I remember announcing to my mother, I've just read a book. But the people like B.B., Dennis Watkins Pitchford, who wrote amazing books from the point of view of geese and foxes and little grey men and gnomes. So he was a huge influence. And then Jack London, anything with animals in it and nature, because our lives seem so similar. So it didn't seem incongruous to me until you went to school and everybody was talking about the Dukes of Hazzard, and you'd have to bluff that you'd seen it or knew what they were talking about. So yeah, lots of books. Richard Jefferies, Bevis, The Story of a Boy. Yeah, and Enid Blyton, obviously, was obsessed with. And then Biggles. The Second World War loomed really quite large in the boyhood of a 70s child. And so I felt that I knew all of that, almost that you were part of it. You half expected to see Spitfires, but anything involving kind of buzzards, you know. So yes, as I say, lots of BB, who's the most wonderful nature writer and really taught me how you write descriptively about the planet. And then later, people like Alistair MacLean. And it was my grandfather was in Bomber Command, in Coastal Command, in fact, during the Second World War. And he had this great collection of Alistair MacLean's. And I worked out about aged 11 that MacLean must spend half his life traveling and the other half of it writing. And I thought, that's what I want to do. And given it was actual sheep farming, you know, in terms of models, I had no doubt at all that it was going to be books.
Incredible. And growing up in the Welsh countryside, Horatio, and then going in to write a lot about the natural world, could you tell us a little bit about the landscapes that have inspired you the most?
Well, it was living landscape. So, you know, on the way to school, a sheep would be seen dead. So you would drag it to the edge. You know, I remember the very cold, stiff feeling of a dead sheep's hoof. You drag it to the edge of the steep field and chuck it down. And then you could go back and watch the buzzards tearing it apart. And then you could go back again and, you know, see the foxes and the badgers and all that sort of thing. And so the countryside to us was never still, and it would invade. So we had great snows when we got snowed in, and we had mice that lived in the kitchen. And rather than sort of trap them, you would give them names, you know, and they'd eat their lentils while you ate your Weetabix. So it was an experience of living not in harmony with nature, but as part of it. And obviously, sheep farming, you're constantly in it. So my experience was that it was vivifying and entirely connected. It was always a great adventure. You never knew what was going to come next. And my mum was wonderful at saying, "Look, children." She was forever saying, "Look," which when I lived in London, it's something you sort of lose touch with, but that I've sort of regained and depended on ever since, really.
Interesting. And what about you, Sam? What kind of areas and locations have inspired you to write the most?
Ooh, let's think. Well, I used to live up north near Manchester, and Manchester is probably my favourite city in England. And I used to like going into cafes to write, and I found it was like London but without the stress. So it's got all this creative energy and that you can kind of feed off. And I do really miss it, actually. I had to kind of give up living up north when I became a carer, but even so, obviously we can't go into cafes now, so it's all, everything's at home. So yeah, I miss that. Yeah.
And both of you have had really interesting careers, and you've written books that span a diverse array of genres. Can you both tell us a little bit about why that is, why you're kind of attracted to writing books in different areas, and what's been your favourite genre or type of writing to do so far? Sam, how about you?
Yeah, well, I got published about 15 years ago. I sent the first chapter of a novel that I hadn't finished. I'd only written this chapter to Faber and Faber, because at that time they were really in their slush pile. And they pulled it off their slush pile and wrote back within a day and said, "Oh, we really like this, we'd like to see the rest." And I then had to go and write the book and hope that they liked the whole thing. And it was a book called A Nicer Way to Die, and it was sort of, I suppose, unintentionally crossover. I wasn't really sure if it was for teenagers or adults. And unfortunately, when I finished it, the editor liked it, and it was published over here, but elsewhere it was published in Germany as adult. And as I also wrote The Quiddity of Will Self, which I enjoyed very much. I never expected to end up writing memoir or non-fiction. I never really felt that I had much to write about. And I suppose that all changed in 2016 when suddenly I sort of became a carer. And it was a big shock to my system. It was a very alienating experience because my mother had died and my father had schizophrenia, but he seemed well and stable and everything was going quite smoothly. And suddenly he had a catatonic collapse, which is quite a rare and strange condition where it's like you're in a coma and the body freezes and you can't speak or eat or move, but you're still breathing. So it's like you're awake, but you're kind of locked into your body. And all of a sudden my dad started experiencing these, and he'd have to go to hospital and then into a psychiatric ward for months whilst they brought him round and he would be back to himself again. And it was, at the time I felt very alienated and I couldn't find any books about caring except for quite dry sort of textbook sort of or help guides, but nothing that felt really personal and visceral.
Mm.
I was completely confused and sort of overwhelmed by the whole thing. And so I kind of wrote the book that I would have liked to have read then. And I think writing it was also about making sense of it, and therefore analysing Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf and looking back at other historical carers. I mean, they wouldn't have been called carers then, but
Mm.
yeah, it's the same role.
What was the sort of, what was easier to write? Was it doing the biographical side of the book or doing the memoir part of the book?
I think the memoir is easier to
Okay.
write. I didn't find it difficult to sort of open up and be quite raw and vulnerable, because when I was going through this experience, I never put anything up on Facebook or Twitter. It just felt too weird to suddenly announce to the world, oh, this bizarre thing's happened to me and my poor dad. And I felt it would have caricatured my dad a bit, because he would have just been sort of simplified into a sort of tweet or an other. And I felt like, but writing the whole book, I got to really explore him and his illness and go into it in a lot of depth and a lot of richness and capture the complexity of it, and I really enjoyed doing that. And I learned a lot about schizophrenia as well myself, even after all these years. So that was the easier bit, I would say. Yeah.
Mm. And what about you, Horatio? What's it like kind of writing a memoir and then writing a story in which you're the travel writer, but also tracing your journey over somebody else's, as with your book about Bark?
Well, they tend to find me. I mean, my first book was a biography of my parents' divorce and a story of growing up on the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just such a strong story that I knew I could tell it, and I could hear all the voices, and I could see the place, and the arc of it appeared fairly straightforward to me. And I thought, why not do this as a first novel, kind of autobiographical? And I thought, actually, no, there's no point. What I want is to get the thing down as it was. It was amazing enough without changing things. So that one I just sort of came out, and it wasn't, apart from the anxiety of writing about a parent's divorce in painful moments, it comes to you. And that's what you really want, is a book that finds you. It hasn't always been the case. So when I did The Single Swallow, that was an idea that found me. And it was, the journey was so wonderful, and there was so much more to it than swallows, that it wasn't quite the book that it appeared to be. It was much more about people than birds, but they're there. And then I've tried to have fun. I mean, with Down to the Sea in ships, I was living in Verona. It was a winter night, and I was walking around the town thinking, what am I going to do? And I'd been reading Melville, and I suddenly thought, it's the second line of that book, when my humours get the upper hand of me, and I have difficulty not joining every funeral cortege that passes and knocking strangers' hats off in the street. I count it high time to go to sea. And I thought, oh my God, it's a massive open goal. And so I sorted that out really quickly. It was like one email to Maersk. I didn't realise they'd said yes at the same time to another writer, Rose George, who was ahead of me. But it turned out it was fine. There was enough room at sea for 2 books about it. Icebreaker found me. I mean, the Finnish embassy got in touch. And so they tend to come sort of organically. And one thing I've learned with writing is that it's no good wandering round and round trying to force a book or typing out pages and pages. They've got to find you, really, ideally. Salman Rushdie said, books find people to write them. And I go with that. So yeah, that's what's driven me across different genre. I mean, the most fun you can have is a travel book, honestly. But then again, when my son was born and I wanted to, that book found me, Aubrey and the Terrible Ute, because I had a baby that was indomitable, and clearly you could see from his character he was just never going to take no for an answer. So you have a hero, or hero's characteristics, and then I wanted to write about depression, which is a monster that can't be killed. And so that book was a lot of fun. And writing for children, as Sam knows, is just so freeing, because they don't really have these neuroses that adults prey to, so you can say anything, which is a lot of joy. And then with something of his art, well, that was a BBC commission. We made a sound walk in the footsteps of Bach, and occasionally with that and with Icebreaker, you think this is too good to leave it. There's definitely a book here. And the Orison for a Curlew came out of a commission from the Royal Geographical Society to find a bird that doesn't exist. And I didn't realise that was a book. What happened was I blew the grant on nappies and a pram. And then I thought, oh shit, So I must make the project report really good. So I worked really hard on it. And then when I sent it in, the RGS said, well, this is like the longest project report we've ever had. Thanks a lot. They didn't ask for the receipts, thank Christ. And so I sent in manuscript a little taller, and they turned it into a beautiful book, or a beautifully made book. So yeah, it's a series of strokes of luck and putting yourself in the way of it. I mean, that's why I left the BBC, was I figured if I didn't put myself in the way of life, then I was going to struggle to write about it.
Interesting. And both you and Sam have had to pour a lot of your own personal experiences into memoirs. It's naturally very personal writing. How do you write honestly about yourself and the people that you love?
As I've got better at it, I hope I've learned to take myself out of it as much as possible.
In what way? How do you do that?
Well, one laptop died when the I key stopped working, and I realised that was probably a sign. So I'm more interested in everybody else than I am in me. So I try and keep my own role in it to the minimum, and that works best in Down to the Sea and Ships. And then in sometimes it's inevitable. But I figure the less you hide, the better. I mean, you've got to assess your own moments in the book in the same way that you'd assess other pieces of material. So you say, is this actually interesting? Or are you trying to do justice to the experience, or are you trying to do justice to the book? And it's really not about what happened, it's about what the reader needs to know. So to the extent that I think that I managed to keep myself out of it, the better they are, really. How do you find it?
Well, I think, I think with the memoir, it had to be, very much sort of personal experience, and that sort of drove the book. But I feel that the quiddity of Will South and my memoir are sort of two sides of the same coin. They're the same book told in completely different ways, which I think most people would find quite surprising. But I think Quiddity is it's a completely crazy book, basically, and it was about a cult who worship Will South and have orgiastic ceremonies in his honor, and it's sort of lots of sections to it, and a ghost which travels into Will South's study and then into him and influences the writing of his book. And it was this kind of freewheeling, bizarre book that was kind of inspired by being John Malkovich and aimed to sort of do the equivalent thing. But it was very much about, I think it had a very schizophrenic flavour, is what I would say about that book. And I think it's really hard to write about schizophrenia in novels, and I still wonder how it can be done, because I don't think it really suits, say, a first-person narrative and a beginning, middle and an ending, because the nature of the illness is that your cell fractures and collapses, so you don't really have a driving eye that influences your thought and your actions, which is why often with schizophrenia there's a kind of loss of desire or a kind of withdrawal, because I don't think you have that narrative anymore of this is my life and my past, my present, my future. So but I kind of feel that when Quiddity came out, it kind of baffled people, and I think I quite liked that a bit. At the same time, it kind of troubled me a bit, and I also feel that when I came to the memoir, I wrote about it in a more classical and straightforward way, and it was just another way of exploring a similar theme.
Interesting. Okay. And I want to talk a little bit about class, which can be a bit of a contentious issue in the world of publishing, but I'm interested in both of you, in the ways that both of you have sort of alluded to that in your writing. Horatio, when you wrote your book Truant, I think it was, you were talking about how you skived off school and you had a very sort of interesting, privileged public school education, but you chose to kind of go somewhere else. And Sam, you've written a lot about how your life changed, obviously, after things in your family changed. How have your class backgrounds shaped your writing, do you think? Sam, do you want to start?
Great question.
This is interesting. I think when I had this experience as a child where my father got ill with schizophrenia, it was quite difficult for our family as a whole, because suddenly we were sort of becoming middle class, and then we failed at it. We kind of nearly made it, and then it sort of collapsed, and the bubble burst. So then we were kind of like a poor family in a well-to-do area. And my dad's illness, he was doing some quite strange things, like walking down the road naked, and so parents were wary of bringing kids over to our house. So we were sort of like a bit of an ostracized family to a degree. And I think that experience is kind of like quite traumatic, but in becoming, if you like, an outsider family, it's also quite a good experience because it puts you in the position of being a kind of witness or observing things, because you have been slightly pushed back. And I think that seems to be quite a common thing in writers' childhoods. I see it's something I see coming up quite often. And then years later, to my amazement, I got into Oxford to study English, and probably didn't quite realize how extraordinary that was at the time, actually, because no one in my family had been to university. But that was actually quite a tough experience in some ways, because again, you're kind of slightly different from everyone. And I think in our country, we tend to judge class on accent. So when I went to Oxford, my accent was not, say, working class. It was probably somewhere between South London and being quite well spoken. People have said my accent's definitely got more posh over the years that I've been a writer. It's like rubbed off on me. But I think, and then if people don't really know you're working class because you don't really have a label, etc., you might just look a bit eccentric or a bit strange because you haven't had this range of experiences, like, or you don't have a childhood in common or necessarily cultural reference points in common with them, and you will have massive gaps in your general knowledge, etc. But they just kind of think you're a bit odd. So again, you're sort of like
sort of torn between two worlds in a way.
Yeah, I don't think that you can ever actually properly change your class. I'm actually writing an essay about this. I'm really interested in it. But
I'm really interested in that as well. Can you transcend your class background? I find that so interesting.
Yeah, I don't think you can, because I think if you grow up in one class, I think you grow up learning the language of that class. Suddenly, as you go into another one, you're learning another language and another sort of set of customs and ways of being, but you're always going to be like, a little bit clumsy or like trying to get your head around it. And it still really interests me now. I mean, just a few years ago, I went into this record shop, this grungy record shop with my friend. So he's like really middle class, works in a bank, and he picked up this punk CD and he gave it to me to buy for him because I was going to buy it for him as a present. And the guy looked at me and said, "Oh, you don't look like a pumpkin." And I was thinking, I'm really well dressed because I've grown up working class and I've got this anxiety, I've got to look presentable, respectable. My friend's working class and he's like, middle class, and he's quite sort of grungy and really going the other direction. He kind of wants to rebel against his class. He wants to look a bit more like working class. And there was this sort of odd distinction between the two of us, I felt, that we're both sort of playing these class games and we're not quite as we seem. Basically, the personas that we're adopting were kind of shields, if you like to say.
Interesting. Have you read the book Lowborn, either of you, the memoir by Kay?
I really want to read it.
It's really good. She talks a lot about sort of growing up and revisiting the working class towns in which she grew up in. She moved around a lot, and a lot of what she said is kind of similar to what you're saying, Sam, about kind of like not feeling as if you really sort of match the exterior that people see that you have. And Horatio, what about you? I was really interested in the way in Truant that you were talking about excluding yourself from quite a privileged school upbringing and choosing to go off the rails in a way. So do you think that class has shaped your writing?
It's a brilliant question, and I have to say it's the first time in hundreds of literary festivals I've ever been asked it. Yeah, it's absolutely fundamental. So growing up on the hill farm, I was very confused when my Welsh friends all said I was posh, because they all had money and video recorders and TVs and we didn't.
Right.
And I remember saying to my mum, "They're calling me posh." And she said, "Well, you are." I didn't realise that she was a tremendously aspirational, slightly snobby individual. But we regard ourselves as hill farming class. That's what we were. And so I took that into public school. I got an assisted place at the age of 11, and I was incredibly defensive and chippy about what I regarded, and my father, moreover, regarded, because he was going through a Marxist phase at the time, a privileged bunch of sort of know-nothings. But it was the first time I'd never been teased for my accent or my name. They regarded it as normal. So that was strange. And then the rebellion came partly through lack of responsibility, because I'd grown up as a little husband to my mother, effectively, and going away to school, all those pressures were relieved. And so I had a very late adolescence, which lasted for about 20 years. And then getting into things like dope and spending a lot of my time feeling at home, in Brixton, in shebeens, effectively, in sort of smoking dens.
Right.
I felt at ease there in a way that I didn't in other places. I've always felt that I was slightly putting it on. And then going to university at York, I didn't have a football team. I don't fit into that conventional role of kind of British masculinity. And again, with my name and my voice, people make assumptions about me immediately that I'm so used now to A, kind of disregarding, and B, trying to puncture. And then when you go out into the world and start writing travel, you realize that, to be anything British is an immense privilege. And again, it's about getting past that barrier, which is kind of easier when you're in the middle of the Congo, because you're just an alien. You might as well have been parachuted in from another planet. And so those aspects of privilege bring with them aspects of responsibility. So I do try, my books are all political, and the more, the better the politics is buried, obviously, the less wearing for the reader, but that's still sort of the point of them. So yeah, it's a fascinating and ongoing negotiation. And living in the north of England, people hear me, again, name, accent, and make assumptions that don't bother me anymore. But it is, I feel less at home here than pretty well anywhere. But I like being an outsider and a stranger because it gives me a place to stand, which is familiar to me, which allows me to get to what people are about. And with travel writing, what you do, or what I do, is I open myself completely, and I say, look, I'm just a sort of fool who doesn't really know anything, and here I am. What's it like being you? And that's what's interesting for me. So the insecurities, in fact, of outsider status and other people's snobbery and other people's apprehensions have, in the end, given me quite a secure place. But the one thing I would say about this accent is that in travel, certainly when things go wrong, is that it saved me multiple times from being beaten up by British police forces. Particularly, they hear you speak, and immediately, you're white, probably public school, probably know a lawyer. And so I had a mental breakdown a year and a half ago. And again, my treatment was entirely different than if I'd been Black, working class, or in the city. And I'm hugely aware of that privilege, and you can see it working. The funny thing is that when you're about to be sectioned, it works against you, because when you really need to be sectioned, you're still talking your way out of it, and they're still listening to you in a way that they wouldn't, if you were somebody else with a different voice. So it's a fascinating area, and really interesting also when teaching. So I was teaching in Liverpool in John Moores, and I was an alien to quite a lot of the kids there too. And again, you have to say, look, it's not my colour or my education that has me standing in front of you. It's the fact that I too have lived and have written about it. But you can see that that's not entirely true, and they can see it too. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's the beginning of a lot of interesting conversations.
I really relate to what you said there about how sort of having this position of being an outsider can sometimes give you insight that you wouldn't otherwise get. So I find that really interesting. And I was just wondering as well, do you think that you can transcend your class background, or do you think you always carry it with you?
I guess you always carry it. I feel like in my own mind I've transcended it, but I will never transcend it in the eyes and ears of other people.
No, I can understand that, and I understand the ways in which both of you are saying that you've been perceived to be something that you don't feel you yourself are. And I think just in publishing as well. Sorry?
It's what you carry and how you deal with it. So there's no reason why you can't. But then the question is, in your own mind, do you ever really?
Definitely. And I guess routine-wise, when it comes to writing, how do you manage to just get the job done? Are you quite strict when you're on a deadline for a book, or do you kind of like relax your routines depending on sort of what stage of the writing process you're in? Sam, how about you?
So this is going to sound like show-offy, but I don't mean it to sound like that. I wrote my first book when I was 11, and I think it was old rubbish. But but again, I think it was all part of what I've been talking about finding routes to escape. So because I would come home from school every day and I'd do my homework and write about 2,000 words. Again, I think mostly it was just rubbish and me regurgitating things I'd read. But I became addicted to doing it, and I always really loved it. And I also felt that I became increasingly fluent with writing and completely inarticulate in my speech. I would be writing words that I couldn't pronounce in my daily life. I still have that problem, actually. So I was quite, I was quite introverted, and so I was developing all my expression through writing. And I think that addiction has just carried on ever since. I've written every day since, and I do feel quite angry and frustrated if I miss a day. I start to get moody. That's why I say I feel it's a bit of an addiction. And I think I probably just enjoy it more than anything else, because it's that feeling when you write that I think a lot of writers, well, people experience it in art, in music, and that feeling of just losing yourself and being written through or taking dictation, that is just very, very, very enjoyable. I mean, the editing's always a bit of a headache, and it's horrible when you read it through in the sober light of day. You think, oh, this isn't particularly good. But that first experience of being creative, I find quite euphoric. And in fact, the thing I find quite hard about being a writer is not the writing, it's all the other stuff. It's like contracts and politics and Twitter, all this other stuff you have to do now to promote yourself, which is just quite cringy and embarrassing. I'd rather just be writing. So yeah, I just get up and I do it morning and afternoon and really enjoy it, basically.
That's incredible that you've been writing every day pretty much since you were 11. Do you think writing is like a muscle? The more you use it, the better you get?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as well, so I first came up with the idea for the Quiddity of Will South in the year 2000, but I just didn't have the sort of ability to write the book I wanted to write. It took 10 years, not working on it continuously, 10 years of gestation, but also just reading and writing, as you say, developing it like a muscle, and developing all the techniques I needed to do to make that book work. And yeah, hopefully I have got better as each year's gone on. So.
And what about you, Horatio? Do you have a routine, or are you writing constantly when you're on these voyages and you're on these journeys as well?
When I'm in the field, as it were, I write all the time. Take it down, as Sam says, like dictation, straight from life. Fill notebooks. I love that process. Right. It's very therapeutic, and also in a working environment like a container ship, it feels good to be doing something resembling work. I used to have a routine. I mean, ideally, when I lived alone, I would get up or rather, I'd start work at 5 in the evening and go on through till 2. 3, but that's not practical, obviously, with children and with a job. So I'm I think of myself as somebody very lazy, and I do anything to defer sitting down. But then when I sit down, I'm quite productive, and it happens quite fast. But I still like to do it late at night if possible, because I like the sense of freedom when everybody else is asleep. And the best thing about writing is the freedom, and I treasure that. So it happens quite quickly when it happens. But no, it's fairly chaotic. And I mean, I've learned over the years that I can pretty well do it anywhere, which you sort of have to do in my kind of writing. So I wrote with single swallow in a room which didn't have a table. So I just sat with my back against a chair and banged it out. And exactly what Sam says about freedom, and when it finds you, and when you're just, I get really itchy after 2 or 3 days if I haven't written something. And then it doesn't matter if it's not for anybody, it needs to come out. And I love that. I think writing for me is probably walking, and then the other bit is the craft. It's like making tables. It's getting the sentences right, and that pure enjoyment of it. But yeah, I'm terrible at sitting down with it, so I tend to build up a well of anxiety and onrushing deadlines, and then hit it.
Yeah, I'm actually the same. I have to do it sort of like that as well. So it must be sort of the pressure that makes you just produce something good right at the very end, because I'm the same. And exactly. Do both of you read when you're writing? Because I've also read differing sort of opinions about whether reading other people's work whilst you're in the midst of writing something yourself can be detrimental. What do you think about that? Sam, sorry, go on.
Okay. Well, I definitely don't stop reading, because I'm writing every day, so I'd never get to read if I sort of followed that rule. And every book I read, I learn from. I think the only thing I would say is now, I mean, during the lockdown, I've suddenly developed an interest in art. I had to start researching it for a novel I'm working on, but I actually just sort of suddenly fell in love with it. I've always just been to galleries and had a really instinctive primal reaction to the pictures I've seen, and I've never really learnt much about it, and I've suddenly fallen in love with learning about it. And I was sort of thinking, I wonder if this will ruin going to galleries to me, because the slight problem with like writing and reading is that you get to a certain point where you open a book and you're dissecting it and you're thinking, and you can sort of see too much. It's like, it's a Wizard of Oz moment where you can see the mechanics of it sometimes, and that can slightly spoil your reading. But on the other hand, if you get an incredible book, you're just completely in awe of it and what that author has accomplished. But I just was wondering, now that I'm reading a lot about art and studying it, whether that's going to slightly change things, and it won't be like quite so enjoyable because my intellect will be kicking in. I mean, there is obviously a lot of value to knowledge, but there's also a real joy in innocence as well. So.
And Horatio, what about you? Are you reading lots when you're writing something of your own, or are you completely switched off and just focusing on your own work?
Well, I love to read for research, and I'm quite ruthless. So I tend to read quite efficiently, and if you know I find stuff that informs the book, then in it goes. So I try and I do the minimum, but make the most out of it. Because it was something like, you know, container shipping, that it's so huge that you just need to kind of pick and choose and use what you find. I read often away from the subject for pleasure. I tend to have lots of books on the go at the same time, and I get really hooked on certain writers, and it's a separate place from my reading. So I think it's right with fiction, actually, but then because of work and lecturing, I tend to have to read a lot anyway, which is great on the whole, unless it's a particularly poor batch of student essays, but they're becoming less frequent. So yeah, no, I read voraciously and across all kinds of genre, and I read trash with huge enthusiasm. Sort of skillful thrillers, like I went through a Don Winslow phase, California Fire and Life, just awesome. And I like to read really far away from my own experience too. So yeah, no, I don't worry too much about it coming into my voice, although it definitely does. But then Sam's absolutely right about learning from people. There's a wonderful Graham Greene essay about Beatrix Potter, and he talks about how exquisite are her paragraphs. And so that makes you think, oh, wow. So anything to do with the craft, I love. And then there are certain people you go back to all the time, like Jan Morris. You know, when you forget that writing in the end is about joy, even if the subject matter is horrendous, a fix of Jan Morris will change that.
Interesting. And having done a lot of travel and 2 sort of autobiographical books, do you think both of them are sort of about journeys in a way? Are they one and the same, being a travel writer and writing about the self, or are they completely different sort of tools that you use when you write about those things?
Well, I love travel because it's not about me, really. You're just the camera. Right. The less you're in it, the better. Yes, but the thing is, of course, you're growing all the time, and in my line, and particularly with things like mental health, you know, the reader does want to know what's happening to their kind of vicarious to the camera, and so a journey changes you, and ideally the reader needs to know that, and also ideally the reader needs to experience it to some extent. So you are pushed back a bit on writing about yourself, but I would always rather do somebody else than me. But it is hard to avoid. But then again, you know, as somebody said, the novel is the greatest technology we have for knowing what it's like to be someone else. Good, creative, properly creative non-fiction should do similar things. I think Martin Amos's best book is Experience. I think it's just wonderful. So it's that sort of thing, really. And I love to try and play with form. Like the one thing, I loathe a page of just pure prose. It wants to be broken up with dialogue and description and space for the reader to think to. So you're always trying to get better at it. And if the reader's involved in that process because you're revealing yourself as you go along, then I think that's fair enough.
And what about you, Sam? What's it been like, kind of, I guess, merging those 2 genres in your last book as well?
So in Fragments, yeah, so I was sort of mixing memoir and then, as you say, biography of Leonard Woolf looking after Virginia and Scott looking after Zelda. Yeah, that was interesting. It was interesting looking at Leonard Woolf because sometimes he's been given a bit of a bad press for perhaps being the rather controlling husband of Virginia. he had there was a sort of period in the 70s when he was sort of cast as villain, and one biographer even accused him of dictating her suicide note. And then I think in recent years, when Victoria Glendenning brought out her book about Leonard Woolf, he was kind of looked at in a more benign and kind way. But I think he was basically a very good carer, and looking at the way he had to look after her during her breakdowns, I think the big issue came in all the time of how much control he should exert, which I have a lot with my own dad, as to how much you should intervene and how much you should step back, because you don't want to, be a controlling force. You want to give them space, but at the same time, if they need help, when should you step in? And I think it was quite a big factor when Virginia Woolf committed suicide, because in those weeks before, he did wonder whether he should call in the nurses to look after her, and he didn't want to, because she really hated having nurses, and sometimes that would also push her over the head, and it would push her over the edge and push her over into psychosis, and it was something she often reacted against. But after she died, he was haunted and wrote letters to his friends saying, maybe I should have brought them in, but I think I made the right decision in the end. And so there is that tremendous responsibility all the time of knowing that it can be an issue of life and death when you're looking after someone who is very vulnerable, and wanting to nurture them but not to interfere, to let them be themselves, if you like. So
And mental health is obviously a theme in both of your works, and this is unprecedented times and a lot of pressure on our mental health, working from home all the time. But for many writers, I guess not much has changed, because we do a lot of solitary work. How do you, I guess, ensure that your mental health doesn't suffer when you're in the midst of writing something that's very personal, or that just requires a lot of brain power? Horatio, sorry, go on.
I can't ensure that. I mean, I realise with the light in the dark that the worst thing you can do for your mental health is sit in an attic reading loads of books and writing them. What you really want to be doing is going out and getting muddy. Having a child helps, and living where I do helps. But I've learned quite a lot about what messes me up. So I'm slightly more ruthless about protecting my time and schedules and stuff, and going out. And actually, I'm finding this. Thank God for the NHS, the BBC, and British nature. A glorious British spring has probably saved countless lives, actually, and improved everybody's. Although I'm acutely conscious of people who can't access it with any ease. So I've got quite good at it, I hope, but it's an ongoing thing. I mean, it's my internal journey, and a lot of my external journeys are partly therapeutic and about getting away from it. And I'd go crazy here in Hebden Bridge were it not for the fact that every now and then I get to get on an airplane or a ship. But no, the other thing about this is that it's changed our relationship with time, and the rhythm is different. And what were we doing? Why did we spend so much of our time rushing madly around, burning up the planet in pursuit of tat, effectively? And this, every time I hear essential and non-essential, I think our whole world was built on the non-essential. So I find this deeply wonderful in that way. And it's fascinating to see how the rhythm of expectation. So, the newspapers are bored with this story now. They want, for a while, they were like, let's get out, want to end the lockdown. And the politicians were feeling it too. And actually, it's not about that. This is a completely different rhythm. And I love the way the days of the week have lost their grip. And so much of our imposed ideas about what rhythm of life is were nonsense. And I think in many ways, this is returning us to the present. And of course, lots of modern life was about the avoidance of the reality of death. It was a kind of inconvenient thing that happened ideally to somebody we didn't know. And now suddenly with the shadow, that's changed our relationship to the present as well. So I feel one lives more intensely. And actually a trip to the supermarket ought to be a vivid, interesting, contentious, alive experience. But for how many years, for all of us, was it just a grind? So there are things about this that are intensely valuable, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I like the optimism in that, because it's very easy to be quite pessimistic about everything that's going on around us. Sam, how have you found this time, and what have you learned about your mental health as a writer and somebody who's writing, I guess, in even more solitary environment now?
I think, well, I would always say that the best thing that's ever happened to me in terms of my mental health was learning transcendental meditation, because when I was 15 years old, I was sort of having a breakdown, but concealing it from everyone. I was very panicked by what was happening. And when I look back, I was showing signs of developing schizophrenia. It's quite common when it's coming on that you get very, apart from, you know, depression or hallucinations and so on, that your senses become acutely vivid. And I remember having all sorts of curious experiences listening to my father playing music and feeling as if the music was kind of entering me, and I had this very sort of curious experience of feeling I was disintegrating and dissolving. It was kind of euphoric, but also a very unhealthy sign as well, and a sort of fragmentation was beginning to take place. So I was gradually getting to a terrible state, and I was suicidal and so on. But I learnt transcendental meditation, and having tried lots of different meditation techniques, and this one wasn't about controlling the mind or trying to be happy or anything like that. It was, I just got a mantra and it kind of did it for me, and I still can't believe how amazing the technique is. It's the one that David Lynch is going around promoting a lot at the moment.
Right, interesting.
And yeah, after a year, I stopped feeling suicidal and depressed, and I just felt neutral. And then after 2 years, I really started to feel happy. And again, that was also instrumental in turning things around and me getting into Oxford as well, because once that stress is cleared out of the way, I could sort of express my intellect a lot more clearly, if you like, and develop my mind and my creativity. So I'm really grateful to have that, because I have found it is really tough. I haven't found it tough. I'm used to going out all day, writing in cafes, traveling around. I did find the isolation really hard at first, and also I'm used to also having pockets of escape from caring and seeing friends or going to a movie before I come back and take on the duty of looking after my dad, which is a pleasure, but it's also a responsibility. But yeah, having the meditation has helped a lot, and I always feel very lucky that I learned at a very auspicious time, and that I always know that I could have ended up like my dad, and I've been very, very lucky not to go down that road, and not to have to take medication and to live a creative life. So yeah, that's been really helpful.
Incredible. I'd like to thank you both for your time. We've just run out of time. I could carry on talking to you about mental health and class and your work for ages, but I think we've reached the limit. So yeah, I'd just like to thank Horatio and Sam so much for joining us, and to everyone at home for taking part in BookBound 2020. There are lots of great events like this on our programme. Search for BookBound 2020 on Twitter and Instagram to learn more, and help us spread the word using the hashtag BookBound 2020. If you'd like to buy the work of our authors, the links in the text below this video will take you through to Hive, an online bookseller which supports independent bookshops. Links to books discussed here and a discount code on selected festival titles are below. You'll also find our authors' favourite independent bookshops across the globe. You can find the link to the Just Giving page, our chosen charity supporting mental health, for Mind below. Thank you very much to the two of you, and goodbye to everyone at home as well.
Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you, Georgina. Brilliant work. So generous and acute.